Okay, so in the previous video, we introduced arguments and the basic approach to analyzing them. And in this video, we're going to go over the approach to analyzing longer and more complex arguments. The concepts that we went over in the previous video are the foundation. And now we're going to see what it is that we need to do to figure out what the premises, subconclusions, assumptions, conclusions, etc., all those things are in those situations when we're dealing with a lot of information and simply inserting premise and conclusion indicators isn't enough. Essentially, in order to determine what the conclusion and what the premises are, you need to have a good understanding of what the argument is talking about. That means that you need to be clear on the key concepts in each sentence and how those concepts are related to one another across sentences, how the sentences are connected. To do that, you need to read each sentence carefully and pay attention to the important elements, the concepts that are given emphasis. Then, as you read each additional sentence, you need to be aware of the concepts that are repeated and any new concepts that are introduced, and how the concepts in those subsequent sentences relate to the concepts in the previous sentences. The point is to build a connected narrative. Now, this is what people do, or should be doing, intuitively. But as the arguments get longer and more complex, it's difficult to maintain focus and keep everything together, and the problem that people have is that they lose track of the key concepts and their relationships. So, this video aims to make explicit what people tend to do implicitly when dealing with simpler arguments. The basic mechanism is pretty straightforward. You need to read each sentence carefully and identify the key concepts, then look for those concepts in the sentence that follows, and as you read the sentence, look for new concepts and determine the relationships between the old and new concepts. Now, this isn't a recommendation to pore over each sentence and spend time trying to figure out which ones are the key concepts and which ones are less important, or to stop after each pair of sentences and try to articulate the relationship to one another in abstract terms. That's actually something that you'll do when evaluating the argument, and you'll only do that for certain question types, and we'll go over that in more detail in the next video. Instead, the point is to approach the argument with the knowledge that you need to pay attention to the sentences and their relationships. The way that you should read arguments is by creating a visual narrative. When you read a sentence and picture a scenario or image that captures that information, then the subsequent sentences are much easier to assess in terms of the relationships because you'll be incorporating those visuals into your overall picture. And you'll have something that's much easier to recall and reference. The way that we absorb and retain information is much more visual than auditory. If you look at any memory system, you'll see that they all train you to make visual associations with whatever you're trying to remember. If you just voice the words in your head, at best you'll be left with a stream of sounds and an image of the argument text. So focus on making a visual narrative, focus on making pictures that represent what you're reading, and adding to those pictures with each sentence so that your overall visual is a coherent whole. Okay, so to recap quickly. To make sense of a more complex argument and determine its premises and conclusion, you need to develop a sensitivity to the key concepts, and you need to make sure to keep track of their connections and relationships across sentences. The best way to do this is to create a visual narrative as you're reading. And remember, you don't want to spend a lot of time and resources analyzing each sentence. What I've explained in this video should be used as a framework to make the arguments easier to understand. Okay, so let's take a look at this argument to see this approach in action. Humans have long been captivated by the vastness of the universe and have wondered about the possibility of extraterrestrial life. For a long time now, a lot of scientists have studied the likelihood of alien contact, but conclusive evidence for any documented contact has not been found. In spite of this, there are people out there who are convinced that there has to be something to it, because some of the studies look like they could corroborate the position that there has been alien contact. Nonetheless, it's usually easy to show that other explanations that don't involve extraterrestrials are better at explaining what happened. Thus, it's too early to come to the conclusion that aliens have been in contact with our government. As a result, it's a mistake to think that our leaders have been lying to us. Okay, so this is an example of a more complicated and longer argument that appears relatively commonly on the test. As I'll point out in the videos later on in this section, the first thing that you always want to take a look at is the question. since that will let you know what type of question it is and what you'll need to pay attention to. And this is all explained as we go over specific question types, but for now, we're only interested in having a good understanding of the argument and what the conclusion and premises are. So we're simply going to read through it carefully to determine the conclusion and how the premises support the conclusion. Once again, we'll be looking at this argument a lot more closely than I expect you to do on the actual test. The reason being that my aim here is to illustrate how to best approach more complicated arguments. After you see what kind of question type you're dealing with, you then move on to the argument and go through the sentences one by one, looking for the key concepts and their connections between sentences. Okay, taking a look at the first sentence, it talks about the vastness of the universe and extraterrestrial life, and about people's attitudes towards these things, captivation and wonder. At this point, we can be confident that the argument is probably going to talk about space and extraterrestrials, but we don't know what it's going to concentrate on specifically. Okay, so humans are interested in space and aliens. The next sentence talks about scientists and their investigations of alien contact and the lack of evidence for contact. Okay, so we see that the argument is focusing in on the extraterrestrial concept already introduced, and it's talking specifically about contact with extraterrestrials. So this sentence takes the concept of the possibility of extraterrestrial life and extends it by talking about it as an object of study that hasn't produced any conclusive evidence of its existence. So humans are interested in aliens and have tried to find them, but unsuccessfully. The next sentence continues with the concept of alien contact and introduces people who believe in contact and their reasons for doing so. So now the argument is continuing with the concept of alien contact, but this sentence shifts and presents information not directly about alien contact or the studies of alien contact or extraterrestrial life, but about the attitudes of a certain segment of the population and why they hold those attitudes. Some people still believe in aliens. And if you noticed, these previous two sentences are disjunctive premises, and we went over them in the previous video, since they hold contrasting views on a particular topic. One says that there's no conclusive evidence for alien contact, and the other says that people believe in alien contact. The next sentence introduces the concept of explanations for studies that suggest alien contact. This connects to the previous sentence because it gives an alternative explanation for those studies that certain people believe are support for the belief in alien contact. So those people who believe in aliens are wrong. And once again, we're dealing with disjunctive premises. The previous sentence says certain studies support the belief in alien contact, and this sentence says that those studies can be explained without interpreting them as support for alien contact. The next sentence introduces the concept of alien contact with our government, and it acts as a conclusion for the previous information. The previous sentence implies that there has been no contact with extraterrestrials, since evidence that seems to support it is better explained as supporting something else. And so if there has been no contact, then our government hasn't been in contact with aliens either. No alien contact, so aliens haven't come in contact with our government. And the last sentence introduces the concept of our leaders lying to us, and this is the overall conclusion based on the previous sentence, which is a sub-conclusion. The previous sentence essentially says that the government hasn't been in contact with aliens, and the last sentence implies that the government has stated that they haven't been in contact, and since there in fact hasn't been any contact, then the government isn't lying. So summarizing the conclusion and premises, we can say leaders haven't been lying to us because aliens haven't been in contact with our government, since scientists have looked for evidence of alien contact, but only potential support can better be explained as something else. So you see, if you go through the argument sentence by sentence, picking out the key concepts in each sentence and paying attention to their connections to what came previously, you can develop a good idea of what the argument is talking about and what the conclusion and support for that conclusion is. Here, the argument starts out talking about people and their attitudes towards space and alien life. It then shifts to scientists looking for and failing to find evidence of alien contact, so it's focusing in on the concept of alien life. It then shifts to people who don't believe the scientists because of potential evidence, so it's adding more detail about the scientist's search. Then it counteracts the position of those who believe in alien contact and uses that to shift and come to a conclusion about government activities. And finally shifts again and comes to the overall conclusion about our attitudes towards the government. And that's essentially how you want to do the more complex arguments. Pay attention to the key concepts in each sentence and how they're connected to one another, and practice doing this so you can do it fluidly and without spending too much time analyzing each sentence individually. If you notice, they gave a quick summary after each sentence that encapsulated everything up to that point. I don't want you doing that, that would take too much time, but if you're having trouble with the arguments, then it's a good initial tactic that will force you to follow the argument carefully and to make sure that you understand everything correctly. Eventually, you want to be able to develop your focus and concentration so that you're putting everything into a coherent narrative as you read through it once. And as mentioned, train yourself to think visually. Okay, so this is essentially our approach to analyzing arguments. In the next video, we're going to go over the steps that you should follow so that you can evaluate arguments.